It was a typical afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood where 9-year-old Tiana lived. She had just finished school, and as she walked home, she felt a sense of excitement. Her day had been good. She had passed her math test and made plans to meet her friends at the park after dinner. The sun was shining, and everything seemed peaceful. Tiana wasn't in any rush. She enjoyed the simple walk home, her school bag bouncing against her back as she walked along the tree-lined sidewalk. The neighborhood was familiar to her. She knew the faces of the neighbors, the sounds of the dogs barking, and the hum of the nearby traffic. Life was simple, and she always felt safe. But today, something was different. As she passed by the corner of Elm Street, she noticed two police officers standing by their patrol car. At first, she thought nothing of it. She had seen police officers around before, and they always seemed busy with their work. But this time, as she got closer, the officers turned to look at her. One of them, a tall man with short, dark hair, stepped forward. He didn't smile or wave. Instead, he held up his hand, signaling her to stop. Tiana stopped walking, feeling a bit confused. The officers were looking at her strangely, as though something was wrong. "Hey there," the officer said, his voice deep and stern. "What's your name?" Tiana hesitated. "Tiana," she answered, trying to sound calm. "You're out here all alone?" The officer asked, glancing around as if looking for someone else. "Where are your parents?" Tiana's heart began to race. She had never been stopped by a police officer before, especially not in her own neighborhood. "I'm just going home," she said quietly. "My mom is at work, and my dad's picking me up later." The other officer, a woman with short brown hair, crossed her arms. She said, looking her up and down. "You're sure you're not out here up to something?" Tiana shook her head, trying to make sense of what was happening. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just walking home like she always did. "No, I'm just going home," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. The officers exchanged looks, and for a moment, Tiana felt a strange knot in her stomach. She could tell they weren't convinced. The male officer stepped closer to her. "We're going to have to take you down to the station," he said, his words sharp. "You're coming with us." Tiana's eyes widened in fear. She didn't understand. Why were they doing this? She was just a little girl, and they were treating her like a criminal. The officer reached for her arm, his grip firm. Tiana flinched, tears starting to well up in her eyes. She had never been so scared in her life. As the officers began to walk her toward their patrol car, Tiana looked around at the people nearby, hoping someone would stop them. But no one seemed to be paying attention. She felt completely alone. Tiana felt her heart pounding as the police officers led her to the back of the patrol car. She tried to stay calm, but her hands were shaking and her legs felt weak. Why was this happening? Why had they stopped her? And why did they insist she was doing something wrong? The male officer opened the door to the car and gestured for her to get inside. Tiana hesitated, not sure what to do. She didn't want to get in the car. She wanted to go home to her mom and dad, but the officer's grip on her arm was firm, and he gave her a stern look that made her feel like she had no choice. She stepped inside the car, the cold seat against her skin, and closed the door behind her. As the car started moving, Tiana looked out the window. She tried to keep calm, but the world outside seemed to be moving in slow motion. The neighborhood she knew so well was quickly fading behind her, replaced by streets she didn't recognize. Every turn the officer made her feel more and more lost, and her stomach twisted with worry. The officer in the front seat, Officer Daniels, glanced in the rearview mirror. "You've made a mistake, kid," he muttered, though Tiana wasn't sure who he was talking to. She had done nothing wrong. Tiana didn't speak. She just stared out the window, hoping for something to change. She wished this was all just a bad dream. But the cold, hard reality of the situation kept her wide awake. She couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong. The ride felt like it lasted forever. It was quiet in the car. except for the sound of the tires on the road and the occasional hum of the radio. Tiana's mind raced, trying to think of what she could say to make the officers understand. But every time she opened her mouth, she was stopped by a wave of fear. What if they didn't believe her? What if they thought she was lying? As they turned onto a different street, Tiana spotted a few more police cars parked along the road. The police station was close, she realized, and that made her feel even more uneasy. She had heard stories about the police station from her friends, but she never imagined she would actually end up there, especially not like this. The car finally came to a stop in front of the station. The officers didn't say a word as they got out of the car and opened the door for her. Tiana stepped out, her legs still shaky. Officer Daniels didn't hold her arm as tightly now, but she felt just as scared as before. She was surrounded by the intimidating walls of the station, and everything about the place seemed so cold and unfriendly. Tiana was led inside, and the heavy door slammed shut behind her. She looked around at the officers who were busy with paperwork or talking to each other. It felt like a completely different world, one where she didn't belong. In the back of her mind, she couldn't stop thinking about her parents. They would be so worried. But she couldn't call them, couldn't explain what was happening. The more she thought about it, the worse she felt. She wanted nothing more than to be home again, safe and sound. Tiana sat quietly in the back of the police car, her mind racing with questions. Every bump on the road seemed to shake her even more. She looked out of the window, but the streets outside didn't look familiar. It felt like she was in a completely different world, one where nothing made sense. The world she knew, the one where she felt safe with her family, was far away. The officer driving, Officer Daniels, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. His face was hard and serious, but Tiana could see something else behind his eyes, something like doubt. He kept looking at her in the mirror, as if trying to figure her out. But he didn't say anything. It was as if the silence in the car had become thick and heavy. Tiana kept staring out the window, trying to hold back her tears. She was scared and confused, and a part of her wanted to scream out, to tell the officer that she hadn't done anything wrong. But what good would it do? She had tried to explain herself earlier, and no one had listened. Now she was trapped, heading to a place she didn't understand, surrounded by people who didn't seem to care. Officer Daniels turned his attention back to the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The car's engine hummed steadily, but for Tiana, the noise only made her feel more alone. She thought about her mom and dad. They must be worried sick by now. She wanted to call them, to tell them where she was, but no one had given her a chance to say anything. She didn't even know if they knew she had been arrested yet. The car made another turn, and Tiana noticed they were getting closer to the police station. The tall, imposing building was just ahead, and Tiana's stomach tightened with dread. It wasn't like in the movies, where everything seemed simple and people could just walk in and out of the station. This place felt cold and scary, like something out of a dream she didn't want to be part of. Officer Daniels took another look at her, but this time his expression seemed different. Tiana couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something like uncertainty in his eyes. Maybe he was starting to wonder if he had made a mistake, but the silence between them didn't give him a chance to speak up. As the car pulled into the parking lot, Tiana felt her heart drop. They were here. The building loomed over her, and the large glass doors of the station looked like they were about to swallow her whole. She looked at the officers, but they didn't say anything, just nodded for her to get out. When the door opened, Tiana felt a cold rush of air. It wasn't just the outside temperature, it was the feeling of stepping into a place she didn't belong. The officers led her inside without a word, and the door clicked shut behind her with a heavy sound that made her feel even smaller. The station was bustling with activity. Officers were talking to each other, typing away on computers, and answering phones. It felt like there was no space for her in all this noise. She stood there, feeling invisible, but at the same time, like everyone was staring at her. Tiana wished more than ever that she could just disappear, go home, and forget about this awful day. But for now, She was trapped in a world she didn't understand, and all she could do was wait. Meanwhile, back in Tiana's neighborhood, her parents, Mrs. Howard and Mr. Howard, had just finished work and were waiting for Tiana to come home. It was a regular evening, just like any other. Mrs. Howard was preparing dinner, and Mr. Howard was in the living room, flipping through a magazine. The house was calm, and the warmth from the oven filled the air. But as the minutes passed, they began to wonder where Tiana was. It was unusual for her to be late, especially when she was so excited to go to the park with her friends. Mrs. Howard tried calling her daughter's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. That's when a deep sense of worry began to settle in. Mrs. Howard's heart started to race. She called Mr. Howard into the kitchen. "Tiana should have been home by now," she said, her voice trembling with concern. "I can't get through to her." Mr. Howard frowned and grabbed his jacket. "I'll go look for her," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm sure she's fine. Maybe she's just caught up talking to a friend or something." But as Mr. Howard stepped out of the house, the panic in Mrs. Howard's chest grew heavier. It wasn't like Tiana to stay out this late without calling. She began pacing the kitchen, looking out the window every few seconds, hoping to see Tiana walking up the street. It wasn't long before Mr. Howard returned, his face pale. "I can't find her anywhere," he said, his voice shaking with worry. "I asked the neighbors, but no one's seen her. We need to call the police." Mrs. Howard's heart sank. They had always lived in a safe neighborhood, and Tiana had never been in trouble. She quickly dialed the number for the police, her hands trembling as she explained that her daughter was missing. The officer on the other end assured her that someone would be sent to investigate right away, but Mrs. Howard couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Hours passed, and the worry only deepened. The police arrived at their house, asking questions and searching the area. But it wasn't until an officer made a call that everything began to change. "Ma'am," the officer said, "we'd found your daughter. She's been taken to the station." The shock hit Mrs. Howard like a wave. "The station?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened? Why is she at the station?" The officer hesitated before replying. "She's been arrested. We don't have all the details yet, but we'll take you there." The words didn't make sense to Mrs. Howard. Arrested? Her daughter? Tiana hadn't done anything wrong. She was just a little girl. Mrs. Howard's heart pounded as she and Mr. Howard rushed to the police station, a feeling of dread settling over them. When they arrived at the station, they were met with an unfamiliar coldness. They were led into a small waiting room where they could hear voices from down the hallway. The air felt thick, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Mrs. Howard's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Her daughter, her sweet Tiana, was in trouble. But why? What had happened? Mr. Howard stood beside her, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. Neither of them knew what to expect as they waited to see their daughter. The uncertainty was unbearable, but they had to know the truth. When Mrs. Howard and Mr. Howard arrived at the police station, they were greeted by a calm but serious-looking officer who led them to a small room. The air was cold, and the walls seemed to echo with the sounds of distant conversations. Mrs. Howard's hands shook as she gripped her husband's arm, trying to steady herself. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat like a reminder that something wasn't right. "We'll take you to see your daughter shortly," the officer said quietly, gesturing for them to sit. His tone was gentle, but the look in his eyes made it clear that something serious had happened. Mrs. Howard couldn't sit still. She paced back and forth, her thoughts spinning. Why was Tiana arrested? What could she possibly have done to end up here? She tried to keep calm for Mr. Howard's sake, but inside, her worry was growing deeper by the second. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. The tension was unbearable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the door opened and a tall officer stepped in. His uniform was neat, and his posture was straight. But as soon as he entered, Mrs. Howard saw his face change from serious to something else, a look of surprise and shock. The officer stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Ma'am, sir," he said, "I'm afraid we have a situation here." Mrs. Howard's eyes widened in fear. "Where's Tiana?" Mr. Howard asked, his voice cracking. The officer hesitated, then nodded towards the hallway. "Your daughter is in a holding room just down the hall, but there's something you need to know before you see her." Mrs. Howard's heart skipped a beat. What could be so important? "Your daughter, Tiana," the officer continued, she's the best friend of the captain's daughter, Captain Harris, the head of the department." Mrs. Howard was stunned. She couldn't understand why that was important. She had never met Captain Harris, and she didn't see how that mattered right now. "Captain Harris?" Mr. Howard asked, his eyebrows furrowing. "Why does that matter?" The officer looked uncomfortable. "We've just discovered that she is, in fact, the captain's daughter's best friend. That changes things. Captain Harris is, well, he's not happy about this situation." Mrs. Howard's head spun. She tried to process the words, but they didn't make sense. Why would the fact that Tiana was friends with the captain's daughter change anything? She felt a rising sense of confusion and frustration. Just then, the door opened again, and Captain Harris walked into the room. His tall frame filled the doorway, and his presence seemed to fill the room. Mrs. Howard's eyes went wide in shock. The captain's uniform was perfectly pressed, but his face showed an emotion that was hard to read: surprise, anger, or maybe guilt. "Mrs. Howard," Captain Harris began, his voice low, "I'm afraid this whole situation has taken a very wrong turn. I should have been informed sooner. This was a misunderstanding. Your daughter is my daughter's best friend." Mrs. Howard blinked in disbelief. "What does that have to do with anything?" she asked, her voice rising in frustration. Captain Harris hesitated, clearly struggling with his emotions. "It means that I take full responsibility for what happened. This should never have gotten this far." The words hung in the air, and Mrs. Howard's heart pounded even harder. There was something more to this story, something she didn't understand. Why had they arrested Tiana in the first place? And why hadn't anyone explained this sooner? "I'm sorry for the confusion," Captain Harris continued, his voice steady but full of regret. "Let me make things right." Captain Harris stood in the room, his hands clasped behind his back, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Mrs. Howard and Mr. Howard were still trying to process the strange turn of events. Their daughter, Tiana, had been arrested for no apparent reason, and now they were learning that she was friends with the captain's daughter. It didn't make sense. Captain Harris seemed to struggle with his next words. I want to make things right," he said, his voice sincere but heavy with uncertainty. "But I also have a responsibility to my department. It's not easy to admit this, but I'm afraid my officers acted out of line." Mrs. Howard couldn't contain her frustration any longer. "Out of line? You mean they arrested my daughter for no reason, and now you're telling me it's a mistake because she's friends with your daughter? That's not right." Captain Harris winced at her words, his face hardening for a moment before softening again. "I know, and I'm deeply sorry. But the truth is, there's more going on here than you realize. My officers, including Officer Daniels, have been under a lot of pressure lately, and their judgment was clouded. It doesn't make what they did right, but I need you to understand that this wasn't something personal." Mr. Howard stepped forward, his expression stern. "So what happens now? How do we fix this?" Captain Harris took a deep breath, as if weighing his options. He knew that admitting this mistake could cost him his career, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. "I'm going to personally look into this. Officer Daniels and the other officers involved will be put under investigation. I'll make sure they face the consequences for their actions." "But what about Tiana?" Mrs. Howard asked, her voice trembling. "What about our daughter? She's been traumatized by this, and no one even gave her a chance to explain." Captain Harris nodded solemnly. "I understand. She will be released immediately. I'll make sure she's brought to you as soon as possible." As Mrs. Howard and Mr. Howard looked at each other, They could see that Captain Harris was truly regretful, but that didn't change the fact that their daughter had been hurt by this experience. Nothing could undo the fear and confusion Tiana had felt. "I promise you," Captain Harris continued, his voice firm, "I will make sure this never happens again. This is not the way we operate, and I'm going to make sure the department takes responsibility for this." There was a long pause. Mrs. Howard looked at Captain Harris, trying to read his sincerity. "How can we be sure this won't happen again?" she asked, still holding on to her doubt. "I'll take full responsibility for this," Captain Harris said again, "and I'll make sure the department is held accountable. I'm not just a captain, I'm a father too. I understand how it feels to see your child hurt, and I will do everything in my power to make things right." Mrs. Howard took a deep breath, calming herself as much as she could. "I want to see my daughter now," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I don't care about anything else. Just bring her to us." Captain Harris nodded and stepped aside. "Of course. I'll have her brought to you right away." As they waited for Tiana, Mrs. Howard and Mr. Howard exchanged worried glances. They didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. They had to make sure that their daughter's rights were respected, and that justice was served, no matter who was involved. As news spread about Tiana's wrongful arrest, the town began to stir with confusion and disbelief. The story of a 9-year-old girl being treated like a criminal for no reason was shocking, and people were demanding answers. The police station, once a place of authority, suddenly became the center of a growing storm. The local news stations picked up the story quickly, and soon reporters were outside the police station, hoping to get a statement. The headlines screamed out in bold letters: "Child arrested for no reason. Police under investigation." Tiana's story became a symbol of something much larger than just one mistake. People began to question the fairness of the police force and the way they treated children, especially those from different backgrounds. Tiana's family had become the face of injustice in the town, and they weren't sure whether to feel proud or overwhelmed by the attention. Mrs. Howard sat in the living room, watching the news coverage on TV. The image of Tiana, so small and vulnerable, kept flashing across the screen. Mrs. Howard felt a wave of emotion, anger, sadness, and even guilt for not having been there for her daughter when she needed them the most. The phone rang. It was a local community leader who had heard about the incident and wanted to offer support. Mrs. Howard spoke to him briefly, explaining that the family just wanted Tiana to be safe and to put this nightmare behind them. But the reality was, things were far from over. The community was angry. People took to social media to share their outrage, and soon there were calls for change within the police department. Local activists organized peaceful protests, demanding that the officers involved in the arrest face consequences. Signs read, "Justice for Tiana," and "Children deserve to be safe." Tiana's family was both touched and overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. They hadn't expected this level of attention, but they realized it was helping to bring the issue of police fairness to the forefront. The public wasn't just upset about Tiana's arrest. They were upset about a system that had failed to protect her and other children like her. Meanwhile, inside the police station, Captain Harris was working tirelessly to handle the situation. He had ordered an internal investigation into the officers involved, and he was doing everything in his power to ensure that justice was served. He knew this would be a turning point for his department, but he also knew that the road ahead would be difficult. As Captain Harris reviewed the footage from the police car's dashboard camera, his face grew darker. He couldn't believe how his officers had treated Tiana. He had seen the video of her being dragged into the patrol car, her innocent face filled with fear. It was clear that this had never been about keeping the peace. It had been about prejudice. In the meantime, Tiana's parents worked to shield her from the growing attention. They didn't want their daughter to feel like she was at the center of a media storm. But Tiana was a smart, strong girl. She had overheard the news, seen the protests, and heard the discussions around town. Though she couldn't fully understand everything that was happening, she knew one thing for sure: she had been wronged. Her parents promised her that they would do everything in their power to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. They would stand by her and fight for the justice she deserved. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the town began to shift. What had started as a local incident was now a conversation happening across the community, even beyond. People were talking about justice, fairness, and how they wanted their children to feel safe. It wasn't just Tiana's parents pushing for answers anymore. Everyone was talking about what happened. Inside the police station, Captain Harris was working hard to restore trust. He had called for a full internal investigation into the officers who were involved in Tiana's arrest, and he wasn't going to let anyone off easy. He knew that the credibility of his department was on the line, and his personal pride had been wounded by the way his officers had treated an innocent child. He had to make things right, no matter the cost. Captain Harris had made it clear to his fellow officers that this wasn't just about paperwork or fines. It was about accountability. Every officer who had been involved in Tiana's arrest, especially Officer Daniels, was now under close scrutiny. Daniels had already been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. The department was facing pressure from the community to take immediate action. There were protests, petitions, and even letters written to the mayor. The town had rallied behind Tiana, demanding that the officers be held accountable for their actions. Everyone agreed that what happened to Tiana shouldn't have happened to anyone, especially not to a child. The voices of the people were impossible to ignore. In the meantime, Tiana's family was trying their best to stay out of the public eye. They didn't want their daughter to become a symbol, but it was clear that Tiana's experience had touched the hearts of many. Her parents were grateful for the support, but also deeply worried about how much attention this was drawing. They just wanted their daughter to heal and return to her normal life. Tiana was still scared, but she was beginning to feel a little better each day. Her parents were helping her through it, reminding her that she was safe now. But no matter how much they tried to comfort her, Tiana knew she would never forget the fear of being treated like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong. Captain Harris took responsibility for the situation, and in a public statement, he acknowledged that his officers had acted inappropriately. He apologized to Tiana's family and the community, saying that this kind of behavior had no place in his department. He promised that the department would be going through additional training to prevent something like this from happening again. "I'll do everything in my power to make sure this mistake is never repeated," Captain Harris said during the press conference. "We are committed to rebuilding the trust that has been lost, and that starts with holding ourselves accountable." The community watched closely as the investigation progressed. Officer Daniels was interviewed, and it became clear that his actions were not just a mistake. They were a result of his own bias and lack of proper training. He faced disciplinary action, and the department promised that there would be changes to prevent future incidents. As Tiana's family watched the investigation unfold, they felt a mixture of relief and sadness. They were glad to see the department taking responsibility, but they knew nothing could fully erase what had happened to their daughter. Still, they were hopeful that this experience would bring about real change and that no other child would have to go through what Tiana had faced. After weeks of investigation, community protests, and media coverage, things slowly began to settle down. The police department had taken action, and the officers involved in Tiana's wrongful arrest faced consequences. Officer Daniels, along with a few other officers, was placed on probation, and Captain Harris had made it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated again. For Tiana and her family, it felt like a small sense of justice had been served, but the emotional scars from that day would take longer to heal. Tiana had started to feel more comfortable, but she still had moments where she would quietly sit by the window, her thoughts far away. Her parents tried their best to reassure her, but they knew it would take time for her to fully feel safe again. One afternoon, as Tiana sat at the kitchen table with her mother, she looked up at her, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and sadness. "Mom, why did they stop me?" she asked, her voice soft. "I didn't do anything wrong." Mrs. Howard took a deep breath, holding back tears. "I know, sweetheart," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know why they did that, but I promise you, it wasn't your fault. You are a good person, and you have nothing to be afraid of." Tiana nodded slowly, but she still seemed lost in her thoughts. It was clear that the question would stay with her for a long time. She didn't fully understand why people sometimes acted out of fear or prejudice, but she was starting to learn that it was something that needed to be changed. The town, too, was changing. After the investigation, local leaders held meetings to discuss the importance of police reform and better training for officers. They wanted to ensure that everyone, no matter their age or background, was treated with respect and dignity. While the road to change would be long, the community felt hopeful that this incident could lead to something better. As for Tiana's family, they continued to speak out about what had happened. Mrs. Howard gave interviews with the media, sharing her story and calling for more awareness about racial inequality and police treatment. She knew that their fight wasn't just about Tiana. It was about making sure that no other child would have to go through what they had. Slowly, life began to return to normal for Tiana and her family. They spent more time together, and Tiana, though still affected by the events, found solace in the love and support of her parents. She resumed playing with her friends and went back to school, but something inside her had shifted. She had learned about courage, justice, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Captain Harris, for his part, worked to rebuild trust within the department. He met with community leaders and made sure that the department implemented new training programs focused on racial bias and how to treat all people fairly, regardless of their background. In the end, the incident became a turning point not only for Tiana and her family, but for the entire town. They had faced an injustice, but together, they had made sure that something positive would come from it. Tiana, though still young, had learned that sometimes the road to justice is long and hard, but it is worth fighting for.